This is the screencast for Chapter 18, Section 6, and we're looking here at how do we deal with air pollution problems, the legal, economic, and technological tools that help us clean it up. So first off, we're going to start with laws and regulations that we have in place. Again, on an FRQ, if you are ever asked what law or act regulates something, go with CLEAN. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, those are the two biggies. So for here, with air pollution, the Clean Air Act is our biggie. Now, it was written and passed first in 1970, amended again in 1977, and it has to be reauthorized periodically. And so 1990 was another reauthorization year. Usually nothing is changing drastically. There's just minor tweaks, and again, we have to make sure that it's still an act that we want passed, and so it comes up for reauthorization. So that's our major law. Now, the EPA is in charge of monitoring our air quality, and they have what are called the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQs. And there's 6 criteria pollutants that they look for. And these are very, very similar to the list that you did in your packet for Chapter 18, Section 2. And so you've got carbon monoxide, nitric oxides, the different ones. You've got NO and NO2. You've got SO2, suspended particulate matter, ozone, and lead. So those are our 6 pollutants that the EPA monitors. Those are the ones that are going to help to determine which urban areas require emissions testing, and that in part determines what kind of funding we get for our highways. That's why Atlanta has to meet certain emissions standards. If we don't, they withhold highway funding from us. And so one of the things I want you guys to remember, because you have to know this list of 6, and it is different, again, than the list that we did that had VOCs in the place of lead. Lead we did as a case study. So on a test, if you're ever asked which are criteria pollutants, you need to remember this acronym, SPLONK. And they're not in the order that they're given in this list, but the S is for your sulfurs, the P is for particulates, the L is for lead. So it's a little bit funny because in this list here, we've got lead listed as PB. But I want you guys to remember that lead, L, and the particulate matter here, SPM, is the P. So sulfur, particulates, lead, ozone, nitrogen compounds, carbon compounds. Okay, so that's your criteria pollutants, SPLONK. There are also national emission standards for 188 hazardous air pollutants, HAPs. This includes our VOCs. So when you did the chart, you looked at VOCs, and that's where they would fall. They are going to be monitored, but it's in a completely different way. It's a completely different set of standards. But these are very hazardous, mostly chlorinated hydrocarbons, VOCs, toxic metals. And then we also have the toxic release inventory, and this is where the industry has to self-report and self-regulate how much of a toxic chemical they release and how they deal with waste management. You hear this referred to mostly when there's some type of a spill or a leak, but with anything that they are releasing, they need to report that. So if there's a natural byproduct to incineration and you're a coal-burning power plant, you have to report the mercury that's released. Now again, it's industry-done self-reporting, so there are some issues here with that. So some problems with our U.S. policy. We rely on cleanup more than prevention of pollution, and we know that cleanup is much more costly. So it's harder to deal with the mess that's made than to prevent the mess from being made in the first place. And so we'll do some things that are prevention-based, like having scrubbers installed on smokestacks, but typically we're relying on cleaning up after a mess has been made. Next thing is we have not raised fuel efficiency standards for cars, SUVs, and light trucks, so that is a lot of extra sulfur, nitrogen, and carbon emissions that are going into the air. And we also learned that those nitrogen emissions are the primary pollutant for the eventual ozone pollution, secondary pollutant, and that's ozone down here in the troposphere. We have inadequate regulation of certain emissions. For example, motorcycles, and two-cycle gasoline engines, and they actually produce more hydrocarbon and 3 times more carbon monoxide than cars. So while a motorcycle might be very fuel efficient, it's also not going to have the same pollution prevention methods, and so you end up getting a very high level of some pretty bad toxins. And the other problem we've got is that we don't regulate air pollution for ocean-going ships in American ports. So we do end up with a lot of pollution in coastal cities where they do a lot of shipping. More problems. Airports are exempt from many regulations. That's a lot of jet fuel. That's a lot of noise pollution. That's just, again, a lot of fossil fuels being burned, and they're exempt. We have no regulation for greenhouse gas emissions, and that goes back to our Kyoto Protocol and the fact that we have not signed. So particularly of concern there is the carbon dioxide. We also have no regulation of ultra-fine particles, and so when you're releasing ash is one of the main ones from a coal-burning power plant, or it could be from a trash incinerator. There are a lot of businesses that might get rid of their trash that way, but we don't regulate those particles, and those particles are then inhaled, and they become pretty problematic for things like asthma and emphysema. Another problem, our urban ozone levels are too high. We try to combat this with things like emissions testing, but again, it's a natural byproduct of a gasoline cycle engine. And one of the only ways that we're going to be able to combat that is switching over to another source for cars that is not combustion related. And so again, the electric vehicle would be one that could fix this problem. Laws don't deal with indoor air pollution, and hopefully you watched the 18.4, 18.5 screencast and you saw just how scary indoor air pollution can be, but there aren't laws for that. There are now some regulations on the books relating to asbestos, but the other things, mold, mildew, things that cause some severe allergic reactions, are not regulated. And we need better enforcement of the Clean Air Act. That's pretty much the case with all of our environmental legislation, because we have the legislation passed back in the 70s, but since then environmental issues have become highly politicized, and so funding gets cut to the EPA, and we're left with not enough people to enforce the regulations that were passed to protect us. Talking about using the marketplace to reduce air pollution, and hopefully you guys remember the cap and trade we did, where you had tickets and we had and we used Smarties as a function to trade in order to get more pollution credits. So that's the idea here with emission trading, cap and trade. You give a power company and industry a certain number of credits, a certain number of tickets to pollute. If they emit less, they can either go ahead and decide to pollute more, or they can sell them. And so again, we've already gone through this. I'm going to skip through some of it. We do think that it will be a good thing eventually. Right now it's being used for SO2. NO2 might be used in the future. Mercury, though, is another big pollutant. And the question that gets raised then is it okay to buy the right to make a toxic emission? Or should we just simply say mercury cannot be emitted from a smokestack? Would that be the better way to go? And so, again, there are business people who don't like this. There are environmental people who don't like this. But right now it seems like a fairly good middle ground, a fairly good compromise. So some more solutions. These are for stationary source air pollution. Very easy to find these, to locate them, and hopefully then to change them. So we've got preventions: burning low sulfur coal, removing sulfur from coal, and that's what we've got with clean coal. The problem is the sulfur just goes somewhere else. Convert coal to a liquid or gaseous fuel, and shift to less polluting energy sources. What we currently do is a little bit more on the dispersion cleanup side. We get taller smokestacks that go above the thermal inversion layer, and that's going to help protect populations in certain geographical areas, like say Los Angeles, or in a valley like we had with in Pennsylvania. We can remove pollutants after combustion, so that's things like scrubbers installed in the smokestacks, and we can tax our pollution. Motor vehicle air pollution, again, we can prevent, we can clean up. Mostly here, we're talking about being more fuel efficient, taking gas guzzlers off the road, doing your basic things like mass transit. You can walk, you can bike, you can carpool. Cleanup, though, what we need for cleanup is we would have to have better emissions control devices, inspecting our exhaust system twice a year instead of just once a year, and having stricter standards. Now, indoor air pollution is one of the things that really freaks me out because, like, again, you guys saw, you learned that things like your shower, things like your sofa and your curtains, these all have toxic pollutants. One of the other things is that when we walk inside, we are bringing inside pollutants with us on our shoes. And so some prevention methods here for indoor air pollution, they talk about cleaning your ceiling tiles and your ducts so that the dust and things that have built up in there aren't just being recirculated. Ban smoking. It should not be done indoors because it just lingers around. So do it in a well-ventilated area or outdoors. Stricter formaldehyde standards for carpet, furniture, building materials. Again, you've got a lot of this in your home, and if you live in a double wide, a trailer home, one of those type of things, you have an RV, it's even worse. And there was a huge study that came out right after Hurricane Katrina that a lot of the people who were put up in temporary shelters by the federal government, by FEMA, they were put into these trailers, these single wides, that had immensely high formaldehyde exposure. We can prevent radon infiltration. That's going to cause cancer. You don't want that. Use well-ventilated office machines. One of the people here at the school who has a bad time with respiratory problems is in our copy room. And you'll sometimes go by and she'll have, especially in the beginning of the year, she'll have a big fan blowing the exhaust out of the room because the copy machines make so many toxins that it gets hard to breathe. And using less polluting substances for our cleaning and our painting. And you can find these options now. Pollution, cleanup, or dilution. Air vents are going to help increase circulation, changing your air filters, increase your intake of outside air. Outside air is actually more beneficial for you than inside air because of all these pollutants that get trapped with us. And you've got some other options listed there as well. Things that you can do to reduce your exposure. Test for radon. Don't buy furniture that has formaldehyde. This is the big one. Take off your shoes before you enter and leave your house. We used to never do that growing up. We just weren't one of those families. We had dogs, so we had tile floors throughout. So we just kept our shoes on and it was easier. But now that I've started teaching APES and I've read these things, we are a take your shoes off kind of family. We've got a big pile of shoes by the front door so that as soon as you come in, those shoes come off and we don't track things through the entire house. Test your house for asbestos. If it was built before 1980, that's when we banned it. Don't store gas, solvents, or volatile hazardous chemicals in your home or an attached garage. That one is very hard to do. Most people who have paint that they've used for a project, they're going to store it in their garage. And what that means is that the fumes are potentially going to make their way through your house and again get stuck in that air filtration cycle. If you smoke, do it outside. Make sure that your wood burning stove, I know because we all have that, but your fireplace, gas burning heaters are properly installed so that they vent correctly. You don't want all of that excess ash to be circulating in your house. And get a carbon monoxide detector in all sleeping areas in case there is a leak, in case there's a problem. Carbon monoxide can kill you quickly and silently. Some more solutions include things like our energy efficiency that we've talked about, using renewable energy sources. So again, you see that same thing that we had back in chapter 15. To reduce indoor poverty, I love this first one, reduce pollution, right, because that's so simple. But poverty is going to be one of the things that leads people to not be able to implement efficiency standards and buy the CFL light bulbs, and they might have to focus more on wood burning, and so they're going to increase their indoor pollution exposure. Distribute cook stoves and solar cookers in developing countries. Reduce or ban indoor smoking, and develop simple and cheap tests for indoor pollutants like radon and formaldehyde. Right now you have to test, send it away, you get it back a few weeks later. It's very difficult, but if it was more timely, more people might do it. And again, I just like to end with little tiny cute pictures. So here is a baby hedgehog, and he's adorable.